I came home from my daughter's wedding expecting to find my greenhouse glowing in the evening sun the way it always had. But instead I found twisted steel, shattered glass, and thousands of dead plants spread across the dirt like someone had dropped a bomb in the middle of my life's work. The woman responsible was probably sitting comfortably in her kitchen at that exact moment, thinking she had finally won. What she didn't know was that she had just destroyed the one thing quietly protecting the pride and joy of her entire neighborhood. And 6 weeks later, the consequences would start spreading through that community like a slow disease no amount of money could stop. My name is Daniel Mercer, although around Pine Ridge County, most people just called me Dan from Mercer Nursery. For 15 years, I had operated a 9-acre nursery outside the town of Ashford, long before luxury subdivisions started swallowing up farmland one field at a time. My greenhouse wasn't some hobby project sitting behind a suburban fence. It was a commercial operation nearly 80 feet from my property line where I grew heirloom seedlings, specialty perennials, and rare orchids that supplied garden centers across 3 counties. Every beam, every irrigation line, every pane of glass had a story attached to it, because I built most of it myself. There were nights when I'd be out there at 2 in the morning checking temperatures during a cold snap, and mornings when I'd walk through rows of orchids with a coffee mug in my hand, thinking maybe all those years of hard work had actually been worth it. Then came Hawthorne Creek Estates. At first, I didn't think much about it. Developers bought up hundreds of acres surrounding my property, and within a couple years, what used to be open farmland turned into rows of expensive homes with decorative mailboxes and perfectly trimmed lawns. Most of the new residents were polite enough. Some even became customers. But every neighborhood has that one person who decides they're not just moving somewhere, they're improving it. In Hawthorne Creek, that person was the HOA president, a woman named Valerie Monroe. Valerie had the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. The first time we met, she stood at my fence line, staring at my greenhouse, as if she were inspecting a crime scene. "You know," she said, crossing her arms, "that structure really doesn't fit the character of the neighborhood." I laughed because I honestly thought she was joking. That's probably because the greenhouse was here 15 years before the neighborhood. She didn't laugh back. Looking back now, that should have told me everything I needed to know. Over the following months, she sent emails, letters, and eventually formal complaints claiming my greenhouse was visually disruptive, negatively affecting property values, and violating community appearance standards. Every time I explained the same thing. My business predated the subdivision. The county recognized my agricultural exemption. The greenhouse was completely legal. End of story. Or at least I thought it was. One afternoon, Valerie showed up in my office carrying a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. She placed it on my desk and slid it toward me. 45 days, she said. Remove the greenhouse or the HOA will begin imposing fines. I opened the folder and stared at pages of legal language that would have been intimidating if any of it actually applied to me. "Valerie," I said, trying to stay calm, "you don't have jurisdiction over my property." "We'll see about that." There was something in the way she said it that bothered me. It wasn't confidence. It was entitlement. Like she genuinely believed reality itself would eventually bend to her opinion. I hired an attorney just to be safe. The county confirmed my protections again. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. She couldn't touch me. Eventually, the letters slowed down, and for the first time in months, things seemed quiet. Then my daughter, Emily, got married. If you're a parent, you know how those weeks go. Between family flying in, rehearsal dinners, last-minute disasters, and trying not to cry during the ceremony, the nursery wasn't exactly my top priority. Emily had waited years for that day, and I was determined not to let business worries distract me. The wedding was beautiful. I remember standing under a string of lights, watching her dance with her husband, and thinking life was finally slowing down. I had no idea that back home Valerie Monroe was making a decision that would change everything. 2 days later, I pulled into my driveway, just after sunset. At first, I thought I had taken a wrong turn because something looked off. Then my stomach dropped. The greenhouse was gone. Not damaged. Not partially dismantled. Gone. Where 30,000 square feet of glass and steel had stood for years, there was now a field of wreckage. My truck stopped in the middle of the driveway. I don't even remember turning off the engine. I just sat there staring. Then I got out and started walking. Every step felt heavier than the last. Crushed irrigation lines crunched beneath my boots. Rare orchids worth hundreds of dollars each were scattered across the dirt. Seed trays had been buried under twisted metal. Entire growing sections had been flattened. The smell of wet soil mixed with broken vegetation hung in the air. It felt less like property damage and more like attending a funeral. And standing in the middle of that destruction, looking at 15 years of work reduced to debris, I realized something that made the anger hit even harder. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had wanted this. Someone had looked at everything I'd built and decided it deserved to disappear. The next morning, I started making calls before the sun was fully up. My attorney nearly dropped the phone when I told him what had happened. The county inspector was even more shocked. By noon, I had learned something that somehow made the whole situation worse. There had never been a demolition permit. No court order. No county authorization. Nothing. Valerie had hired a private demolition contractor and convinced them the structure was violating HOA regulations. Apparently, the crew never bothered verifying ownership or jurisdiction. They simply showed up with equipment and started tearing things apart. The contractor's foreman looked sick when he met me on site later that week. "Sir, we were told the property was under HOA authority." I stared at him for a long moment. Did it ever occur to anyone that a commercial greenhouse sitting on agricultural land might not belong to a homeowners association? The man didn't have an answer. Honestly, I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Because no matter how embarrassed he looked, 12,000 plants were still dead. Customers were still canceling orders. Years of selective breeding and cultivation were gone forever. There are losses you can calculate on paper, and then there are losses that live somewhere deeper. Some of those orchids had been propagated from stock I'd spent over a decade developing. You can't write a check and replace 15 years of patience. For about a week, my life became a blur of insurance meetings, legal consultations, inventory reports, and phone calls. Everyone kept asking the same question. How much was destroyed? The answer kept growing. $75,000 in structural damage became $90,000. Then inventory losses pushed the number higher. Then came lost contracts, interrupted production cycles, and future revenue projections. Every calculation seemed uglier than the last. Meanwhile, Valerie acted like none of it was her fault. During an emergency HOA meeting, she reportedly told residents she had protected community standards. Protected them from what exactly? Nobody seemed entirely sure. A greenhouse, flowers, seedlings. The terrifying threat of agriculture, apparently. One of my customers attended that meeting and later repeated something Valerie had said. Some sacrifices are necessary to preserve property values. I remember laughing when I heard that. Not because it was funny, because it was so absurd, I genuinely didn't know how else to react. The woman had destroyed a local business and was talking like she'd liberated Europe. But while everyone else focused on lawsuits and damages, my attention kept drifting toward something else. Something most people didn't understand. You see, running a nursery for 15 years teaches you things that don't show up in gardening magazines. Healthy plants aren't just about water and fertilizer. They're about ecosystems, invisible partnerships happening beneath the soil. For years, I had been introducing beneficial nematodes, mycorrhizal fungi, and microbial cultures throughout my property. These organisms helped roots absorb nutrients, suppressed harmful pathogens, and created a naturally balanced environment that reduced disease pressure. Most gardeners know pieces of this. Very few understand how interconnected it becomes over time. My land sat on a gentle rise overlooking the surrounding area. Groundwater moved gradually downhill through layers of soil beneath neighboring properties. The beneficial organisms I maintained didn't stop at my fence line. They spread naturally through the underground ecosystem, not aggressively, not dramatically, just quietly doing what nature does. I remember mentioning this years earlier during a county agricultural workshop. Nobody thought much about it at the time. Why would they? Then, one afternoon about 3 weeks after the demolition, I received a call from an old friend named Walter. Walter worked as a landscape consultant and occasionally did projects for Hawthorne Creek Estates. "Dan," he said, Have you heard what's happening with the Rose Garden? I hadn't. Hawthorne Creek's Rose Garden was famous locally. Valerie loved showing it off. Every newsletter featured photos. Every community event seemed to happen nearby. The garden covered nearly an acre and contained hundreds of hybrid tea roses maintained at enormous expense. They had won regional beautification awards multiple years in a row. Valerie treated those roses the way medieval kings treated crown jewels. "What's happening?" I asked. Walter hesitated. "Something's wrong. Black spotting. Root issues. Decline rates are accelerating." I didn't say anything right away. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. Not satisfaction exactly. More like recognition. By week 4, the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Leaves yellowed. Stems weakened. Blooms failed prematurely. Entire sections of the garden lost vigor. Hawthorne Creek hired specialists. Then more specialists. Then more. Soil samples were collected. Water tests were conducted. Treatment plans were implemented. Nothing seemed to work. The first time I visited the area after hearing the reports, I parked across the street and watched from inside my truck. Residents wandered through the garden, examining damaged plants with worried expressions. Maintenance crews moved from bed to bed carrying equipment. Valerie stood near the center fountain, talking animatedly with a consultant. Even from a distance, I could tell she was angry. The garden looked different. Not dead yet, but struggling. Like a patient trying to hide an illness. A few days later, Walter called again. This time his voice carried an edge of disbelief. "You're not going to believe this." 4 independent horticultural specialists came to the same conclusion, which is the microbial balance collapsed. I leaned back in my chair. Meaning the beneficial organisms that had been suppressing pathogens are gone. Rot is spreading. Nematode populations are increasing. Fungal pressure is escalating. They're basically fighting the entire ecosystem. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Walter asked the question sitting between us. "You think the demolition had something to do with it?" I looked out the office window toward the empty space where my greenhouse used to stand. I think actions have consequences. Summer turned into early fall, and the situation worsened. Hawthorne Creek spent tens of thousands of dollars trying to save the garden. Chemical treatments, organic treatments, soil replacement, root drenches, biological amendments, every possible solution. The problem was that ecosystems aren't machines. You can't remove a foundational piece and expect everything else to function normally. Nature doesn't care about budgets, HOA authority, or public relations campaigns. Nature only responds to cause and effect. By September, entire rose sections had turned brown. Award-winning specimens that had taken years to establish looked like neglected shrubs abandoned beside a highway. Homeowners began asking questions. Expensive questions. Uncomfortable questions. Why had the declines started immediately after the greenhouse demolition? Why were legal fees increasing? Why was the HOA spending community funds on emergency horticultural interventions? Most importantly, who had authorized the destruction that started the chain reaction? The answers were beginning to surface, and Valerie was running out of places to hide. The woman who once dominated every board meeting now spent most of her time defending herself. Residents who had supported her started distancing themselves. Board members suddenly claimed they hadn't understood the full situation. Funny how quickly confidence disappears when invoices start arriving. Then came the town hall meeting that changed everything. According to 3 different people who attended, one homeowner stood up and asked a simple question. Did anyone verify the HOA had authority before destroying Mr. Mercer's greenhouse? The room reportedly went silent, because everyone already knew the answer. Nobody answered that question right away because sometimes the truth is so obvious it doesn't need words. The silence itself becomes the answer. According to people who attended, Valerie tried redirecting the conversation toward community standards and long-term planning, but the room had already shifted. Homeowners weren't interested in landscaping philosophy anymore. They wanted accountability. One resident reportedly stood up and said, "You destroyed a man's business, and now we're paying for it twice." Another asked how many legal warnings had been ignored before the demolition happened. Then someone brought up the mounting legal expenses. Someone else mentioned the dying rose garden. Within minutes, the meeting had transformed from a routine HOA gathering into something that looked a lot more like a public trial. Over the next several weeks, the unraveling accelerated. Documents surfaced, emails surfaced, internal communications surfaced. The picture became painfully clear. Multiple people had warned Valerie not to proceed. County officials had explained the agricultural exemptions. Attorneys had questioned the HOA's authority. Board members had expressed concerns. She pushed forward anyway because somewhere along the line she had convinced herself that being determined was the same thing as being right. It wasn't. By October, nearly every rose in Hawthorne Creek's showcase garden was dead. Not struggling, not recovering, dead. Hundreds of award-winning plants reduced to brittle brown sticks surrounded by expensive landscaping that suddenly looked abandoned. The neighborhood that once proudly featured the garden in brochures now avoided photographing it altogether. Residents who used to take evening walks through the rose beds now crossed the street to avoid looking at them. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Valerie had spent years obsessing over appearances, and now the most visible thing in the entire community was the consequence of her own decisions. Then came the resignations. First, Valerie stepped down. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, everyone knew exactly why it happened. The pressure had become impossible to survive. 2 board members faced recall campaigns. Community meetings turned tense. Lawyers became regular visitors. The HOA's insurance carrier launched its own investigation. Meanwhile, my lawsuit continued moving forward. People sometimes imagine lawsuits are dramatic courtroom battles with surprise witnesses and emotional speeches. Most aren't. Most are long, exhausting processes involving paperwork, depositions, financial records, expert evaluations, and endless negotiations. Ours was no different. We documented everything. Structural losses, inventory losses, future revenue impacts, business interruption damages, specialized plant stock that could not be immediately replaced. Every number told part of the story. Every photograph told another part. Every expert report added more weight. Eventually, the new HOA board reached the same conclusion everyone else already had. They weren't going to win. The settlement discussions began shortly afterward. The final agreement totaled $285,000. When people hear that number, they sometimes assume I felt victorious. The truth is more complicated. The money helped. It allowed me to rebuild. It covered losses that otherwise might have destroyed my business. But no settlement restores lost years. No check brings back rare plants that took a decade to cultivate. No legal victory erases the feeling of walking through ruins where your livelihood used to stand. What it did provide was a chance to move forward. So that's exactly what I did. Construction started the following spring. The new greenhouse was larger, stronger, and more efficient than the original. Better climate controls, better irrigation systems, better infrastructure. Friends from the agricultural community volunteered time and equipment. Longtime customers placed advance orders before the first crop was even ready. One afternoon, while the new frame was going up, my daughter, Emily, stood beside me watching the crew work. You know, she said, smiling, it kind of feels like they accidentally funded your expansion project. I laughed harder than I had in months. That's one way to look at it. It's the correct way to look at it. Maybe she was right. We also installed something new along the property boundary. A tall decorative security fence designed partly for privacy and partly to discourage future visitors with demolition fantasies. The first time I saw it finished, I couldn't help smiling. Not because it was hostile, because it represented peace, boundaries, clarity, a simple reminder that some lines exist for a reason. These days, the nursery is doing well. Better than well, actually. We expanded our biological soil program and started selling beneficial microbial products to gardeners throughout the state. Ironically, the very organisms that became central to this entire mess are now one of our most popular product lines. Every spring, thousands of customers use them to improve soil health and strengthen root systems. And yes, before anyone asks, There's a small note printed on every label. It's mostly a joke, although not entirely. It reads, "Product performance may be affected by outside interference, including excessive HOA involvement." Customers love it. Some laugh. Some ask for the story. Most assume I'm exaggerating until they hear the details. Then they usually just shake their heads. Looking back now, what stays with me isn't the money or the lawsuit or even the destruction. It's how easily power can convince people they're immune from consequences. Valerie genuinely believed she could bulldoze reality into matching her preferences. She thought ownership, law, expertise, ecology, and common sense were obstacles she could simply ignore. For a little while, it even looked like she might get away with it. Then reality showed up with its own opinion. The funny thing is I never poisoned anybody's rose garden. I never sabotaged anything. I never touched a single flower. Nature handled the rest all by itself once the balance was broken. And that's the part people argue about whenever I tell this story. Some say I should have warned them. Some say they deserved every bit of what happened. Others think both sides could have done things differently. Honestly, after all these years, I'm still not sure where I land. What I do know is this. When people stop respecting the systems they depend on, whether those systems are legal, environmental, or simply human, they eventually discover how fragile those systems really are. So now I'm curious what you think. Was Valerie entirely responsible for what happened? Or should someone have stepped in before things reached that point? If you had been in my position, would you have handled it differently? Let me know down in the comments, because this is one of those stories where almost everyone agrees a mistake was made, but nobody agrees on exactly where the line should have been drawn.